Okay, so today I want to talk about grief. And I feel like normally when we jump into this, we're kind of light and airy and it feels different.
Yeah.
That we should have a different posture thinking about grief.
Yeah.
So up for discussion on grief today?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so one of my many soapboxes, as we've established by now, there are many, is that we have a really narrow view of what grief is. I don't think culturally we talk well about grief.
Okay.
And so I would just like to explore some of my thoughts about identifying, walking through, processing grief.
Okay. That's perfect. Let's start here because I'm the one that doesn't know anything about emotions and you're the one that knows the things, So let's start here with what I know about grief, and probably what most people, maybe a little less than most people, but what most people think of when they hear the word grief. Does that sound right? So I think grief is really a lot of times narrowly defined in a small window of, tragic things happening and then us sort of processing through them, right? So there's an event that happens, a death of a loved one or something, and then we're kind of moving through these levels of grief and these stages of grief and that sort of thing, and then it's kind of done.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay.
And so even to me, with that definition of what grief is, while we may not say to one another, there are societal, cultural expectations of who you are allowed to grieve.
Who you're allowed to grieve?
Yes.
Okay.
In a public way, I think.
Okay, so it has to be close enough to you.
Yes.
Like,
the
if it's a friend of a friend,
You
maybe
can't feel sad about it
okay.
because maybe you didn't have, you lose someone tragically who maybe you didn't have a super close relationship.
Right.
And then it's like, well, why is Curry feeling that way about this? Like, we are often judging other people's response to any type of loss.
Right.
Like, why do we have business doing that?
Well, I think people have too many opinions.
On all things. Truth. I will absolutely agree with you.
Can we step back, though? Because that is insightful. How would you define grief? Or, what even is grief?
I mean, I think it's that deep sadness.
It's just so it's a deeper sadness than sort of your run-of-the-mill sadness, I guess.
Maybe. I think not helpful. And I think part of it is I don't know that there is a definition of grief.
Okay.
And yet we operate under the assumption that grief is this one thing. It presents itself in one way. And sure, we do have the stages of grief, which is very helpful.
Yeah.
Even this awareness of the stages of grief are not linear. You can come back to a stage, all of the. And so I think even the stages of grief gives us this level of comfort of we have shared language, there's understanding. To me, the pushback is two people can lose someone who was close to them. They are not going to experience it in the same way.
Yeah, right.
Also, the time frame that we give, I have never worked at a place, and I think by my third job, I just started tracking this because I'm weird, that gives more than 3 days of bereavement.
Right.
And to me, to think that you could lose a parent, partner, child, and that your work is you get 3 days, figure that out, and then we expect you to be back.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I guess what I'm trying to unpack or trying to understand here is, death of a loved one is an easy sort of way of understanding grief. Is that the only context in which people have grief, or can you have grief about stuff that's not a loved one?
Thank you for that on-ramp.
Sure.
For what I want to talk about.
I don't know. I'm really asking.
I think this is something that I do really well as a therapist, is help people understand greater parameters of what grief could be.
Okay, sure.
Such as, you can have a death of a dream that may not have the same impact as a loss of a loved one, and yet we don't have language to say you were headed on a path, you were hopeful, and you envisioned what the future in this direction looked like.
Yeah.
And when there was a hiccup, roadblock, something that kept you from that, we give platitudes like, oh, there's a silver lining, or it must mean there's something better for you.
Yeah. Platitudes are a go-to for sure. It makes us feel better.
Yes, because we don't want to sit with someone else in sadness.
For sure.
Again, we understand when there's a loss of a loved one.
Yeah.
The way you show up for people is you attend the service.
Right.
You bring the family a meal.
Yeah.
You make sure to check in on anniversaries, all their firsts. And then after that, like, you can say, good to go. I met all my check boxes.
I mean, I would say that's even probably a...
generous.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
And so if I don't know how to, like, we're not talking about how do we show up for other people in grief and how do we experience our own?
So would you say that grief could be defined as a deep sadness because of a loss of something or someone?
Yes. I think we could operate under that definition.
So you could lose a lot of different things, like a death of a dream, you said, right? But the grief can appear in all sorts of different places, like a loss of maybe a relationship, right, that you once had, right?
Yes.
Friendship.
I also think, again, sometimes when we're talking, I take these things to the extreme because that is the work that I do.
You're a little dark.
I am. And I think
don't I always say a way to ruin a party is to
bring a social worker.
Bring a social worker.
Have me tell a story because sometimes
that's right.
Don't judge social norms well. Anywho, I do think even, how do you grieve the loss of a relationship when the person is still living?
Yeah.
It's such a real thing. It is a huge part of my work. And yet, when I try to name for someone, I wonder if there's grief starting to bubble up here. Oftentimes, there's pushback of like, oh, there's not. Oh. And I would never be so bold as to say like, no, there's grief. Sometimes I will kind of give a parameter of, you may not be feeling that right now.
Yeah.
And the grief may come. And I want you to have an awareness that there could be grief that bubbles up. My hope for you is, yes, that maybe the grief won't come. And how can we not be surprised if it chooses to show up?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm trying to think. So I guess there could be a lot of people that are experiencing grief and just can't name it that because maybe you're not allowed to still be grieving or you're not allowed to experience grief because it's not that big of a deal kind of societally or whatever. So there could be a lot of people walking around with grief that they just haven't named that. Correct?
Correct.
Yes.
Which is one of my many plugs. This is why you go to therapy when you feel off. Oftentimes people are not coming to me for grief work, and that ends up being a part of our process because as humans, we have losses. I mean, and another significant thing that I think we don't talk about is even like having to leave a place or community that you love for whatever the reason. Like I think about in our move, we were doing what was best for our family, what we needed to do. And the grief of leaving a beloved community, there was understanding of that we would be sad.
Yeah.
And I won't speak for you, but I think even the depth of grief that I experienced and how long that grief lasted surprised me.
Yeah.
And this is like literally what I do and talk to people about. And so I think not only is it hard to name what grief is, there is no real timeline to it.
It's very personal.
It's so personal. And I think oftentimes, even when we think we've moved through it, I always say grief is really tricky and it shows up when we least expect it. I may cry for the first time on the podcast. Here we go. Because all emotions matter. Yes. They are welcome here. But I was just thinking about even this idea of how grief pops up is I can still vividly remember standing in our Illinois kitchen making fried okra. The same way that my grandmother, my whole life, had made fried okra. And she had been gone for at least 4 years, if not longer. And I remember standing in my kitchen and being so shocked that making dinner brought up these feelings of grief, of missing, of longing, of remembrance. And just this realization of oh gosh, I tell people grief is tricky. It shows up in all these different ways. You may think that you're quote unquote over it.
Yeah.
And then it pops up again. And we don't know what to do with that. And so I think the more we can have conversation around grief, the more we can anticipate it, I think the less jarring it could be.
Yeah. I have so many places I want to go right now. First of all, I go back to even the pandemic. There was a lot of loss in the pandemic, and different people across the country experienced it differently, but there was a lot of loss. And I wonder how many people are still experiencing some sort of grief from the pandemic. There was loss of relationships. There, like you said, moves. I mean, the world was flipped upside down for such a long time. I wonder if there might not be some persistent grief that's still sort of affecting a lot of people, even though we're supposed to be over it.
Yes. So that idea of persistent grief, yeah. I might even take it a step further and talk about compound grief, which is kind of your griefs are happening so quickly, which I think a lot of people experienced in the pandemic, that you actually weren't able to process the first thing before the next thing came up. And so that grief has just built upon itself. And now you're 5 years out, what do I do with this?
Yeah.
Has that led to depressive feelings that maybe unresolved has led to depression? And because none of us want to sit down and be I'm feeling a little sad. Let me look back at what the last 5 years have held and all the losses that I've experienced and look at them. And I, again, in my work, there are people that I'm currently working with that we are talking about losses from the pandemic that are still impacting them.
Yeah.
And so I do think, even thinking about this idea of compound grief, has grief been harder for you? Or let's say you've had these compound griefs through the pandemic to now, and then you experience a loss in the present.
It brings all that.
It brings all of that up.
Yeah. And the grief that you're experiencing now is harder because there are those unprocessed griefs still lingering as well. Dang.
Yeah.
Whew.
And so I think this is one of my therapeutic things, a hill that I will die on, because I just think if we are aware enough as people and we're doing this work ourselves, it also gives us grace in interacting with other people.
Yeah.
I can't tell you the number of times, right? Once there are lots of clients that I work with for a long time.
Sure.
And when we have done years of work together, they will parrot me and the things that about the work we have done together back to
parrot? Me. Okay, parrot. Okay, got it.
And it's amazing to me when a client will say, I think that I'm having grief around this, and I wouldn't have known to name that had I not been in therapy.
Right.
Had I not allowed like my idea of grief to expand. And I mean, I also think it's expanding your view of grief allows for self-compassion, because I think so often when we are in a place of sadness, darkness, whatever you want to call it, the narrative becomes, what is the matter with me?
Yeah.
And so if we can name, instead of what is the matter with me, of I'm in a place of deep grief,
yeah,
it just changes the narrative and the conversation.
Ooh, yeah, that's deep. So I think you probably answered this in some way, but what would you say would the consequences be of compound grief, or like letting grief linger and not addressing it?
So you could read a lot of research, people with smarter than me and more education, in a very elementary way. I mean, not to get all woo-woo, but I think that grief like lives in our body. Like there can be somatic complaints that come with storing that in your body.
I don't know if you know this, you may not have, but the brain and the body are very connected, and like, you know, things that you like stresses can present themselves in your body. I don't know.
It's like there's this book called The Body Keeps the Score that really, if you want a deep dive, that's the book.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes people will actually be experiencing physical pain, and it's like, that is the grief living in your body.
Yeah, your body holds on to that sort of stuff.
I think another place is like, it is hard to be in relationship if you have significant unaddressed grief, right? Like, I may be kind of challenging to be around. I may kind of feel in a funk. I may not want to socialize. It may feel, I think sometimes grief, we just get so comfortable with it that we like to hold on to it, because it's like, I'm feeling isolated in this place that I'm in. If I can just hang on to this grief,
it's more comfortable than kind of
having to process it and share it with someone else. And what are they going to say? Yeah. And so I think, you know, interpersonally, grief can manifest in that way. I also think if you are grieving communally, it's really tricky because, again, we don't all grieve in the same way. And so let's say within a friend group, there's a loss. Well, everyone in that group is going to process in a different way. And if you are the one who is maybe slower to process, you know, and you're seeing, your perception is that everyone else is moving on and is feeling better. Again, it's, what is that narrative? What is wrong with me? Why can't I get past that? Versus, this is really a lot to cope with. Of course, I'm coping different than other people are, because we are different. My support system, my self-care, all of those things may be different.
What other stressors I had previously, right? What I'm carrying at work.
Yes.
Could change
so
that.
many things. And so I think even comparison within grief is really unhealthy.
Yeah.
And I think that is something, and I do think, right, it's a tightrope that we're all walking. Like, sometimes we do need someone to come alongside us and be like, you cannot stay there anymore.
Right. It's time to move on.
Come with me.
Yeah.
Take a shower.
Right.
Leave your house.
Yeah.
And having this compassion around, your grief looks different than mine does. How can I sit with you here? How can I be present with you?
Yeah.
Versus, what is wrong with you? It's been a month. It's been a year.
Yeah.
It's been 3 years. Like, the grief will change.
Yeah.
And I think we have this idea that even if we know in our own lived experience with grief that it doesn't necessarily go away, our expectation is still that it's going to go away.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that makes sense. That is a lot to kind of think about and process, because it looks so different. Something that is occurring to me as we're sort of talking, because the one thing that people do know about grief is the stages of grief, right? There's the denial or whatever it is, whatever the stages are. I wonder if in the systematizing of those stages of grief, in the making of a system, a linear sort of system, that we've so systematized it that it like doesn't exist for us anymore, or we've systematized it into kind of oblivion in some way, so that grief has to look a certain way, because this is what people have told me it's supposed to look like, and if it doesn't, then it's not grief, or I need to just get over it, right? So maybe grief just needs to be a little less systematized and a little more sort of sat with. Grief takes being as opposed to doing, and we're not good beers, we're good doers.
I think there's so much truth to that. And I think whether it's grief or any other emotions of discomfort, we don't like to sit in that.
We tend to move through, we want to move through them.
Yeah. And we want a solution. And I think sometimes the solution of grief is to move through that.
Yeah.
And so I think it's an awareness for us. I think, and moving through the world with the assumption that grief is going to come. Mm-hmm. That is the reality.
Yeah.
And not in a hyper fixated.
Yeah, it's not like a pessimism or
yes. And with a really realistic viewpoint of, I will experience this. How am I supporting my mental health right now when I'm not in grief?
Yes.
So that when it comes, I am more prepared.
I was just going to say that exact same thing. If you've processed some of these old griefs that have kind of come about and maybe led to some depressive symptoms or something, if you've processed those, you're a lot more prepared in the future for being a little more resilient. And able to process those things, as opposed to holding on to all these things and then trying to process the whole thing all at once. Yeah.
Yes.
So proactive mental health, again, gets a nod on the podcast.
Always, though, the number of people who, once we kind of get into more maintenance work, we've worked through their crises that they're experiencing, and they're like, oh, I wish I would have found you whatever amount of time ago. And yes, I understand that sentiment. And I always tell people, and I'm glad that you found it now, right? And now we can continue to do collaborative work so that when the next event happens, because it's going to happen, I don't know, right now my language is your life will life.
Yeah.
And
one fact.
And so what are we doing proactively to prepare you for whatever next barrier, hiccup, challenge is to come?
I think it's a good word on a really weighty topic that I feel like we just totally covered. So,
as always, thank you for joining us today for our conversation around grief. I hope that our conversation today helps you expand your own understanding of what grief could look like. If this is something you'd like to discuss further, I would love for you to follow me on Instagram or Facebook at Counseling With, or send me an email from my website at counselingwith.com.